A wedding used to be a rite of passage. Now it's a luxury brand launch. Sophie Hewood.
Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. We're exploring a really deep topic today where I started doing the research on it and it's led me down several rabbit holes, which are going to eventually be videos of their own, where I talk about concepts such as pearl drift and downward mobility disguised as social preferences, and a variety of other issues that kind of emerge as part of discussing the whole social class and marriage dynamic. But for today's video, the main focus will be on social class and marriage. Which social classes marry, which ones don't, what are their motivations behind marriage among the social classes. There's going to be in-depth of multiple parts, and I'm going to start with this first part being a discussion on some of the socioeconomic components, mainly a breakdown of what happened since from 1960 to 2010, where in 1960 basically just everybody got married, really, no matter what class they were in. And by the 2010s, marriage has become optional for, I would say, the vast majority of the population, but not for the reasons that you would think. I read a book several years ago called Coming Apart by Charles Murray. And one of the theses in this book was about how marriage shifted from a universal standard to a cultural marker of class. If you are interested in anything about social class dynamics, I think Coming Apart is a great video because it kind of shows about how moral decay is impacted by economic and class forces and vice versa. Murray's argument is that there was a large class divergence in marriage among the social classes starting in the 1960s. Among college-educated people and those of means, marriage rates remained high and divorce rates remained relatively low. As I mentioned in my Debunking the Doomer about marriage and divorce, it is one of the strongest indicators for your marriage lasting 20 years if both partners have a bachelor's degree or above. Whereas the working class, and the precarious class, marriage just declined steeply, especially with those among the lowest educated. And among those who did get married, divorce rates were considerably higher. The reason why marriage not is only a class thing, but it perpetuates class differences is because of the economic outcomes. First, a lot of people are afraid of getting married, similar to the reason I talked in my last video on marriage, because marriage has shifted from becoming a stepping stone to a capstone. And a lot of people just feel like they can't afford a wedding, and so they put off marriage because of the finances involved in a wedding, or they don't want to get married if things go bad and want the option to leave the relationship because they might not be able to take full responsibility for the partner given their volatility of their career or social circumstances. And I think those are primarily the two drivers initially for marriage declines. But when the thing is that these people don't get married, it's the same thing of people who are permanently renters versus buying houses. There's a similar dynamic. They just get less of a sense of ownership of their community and of marriage, their relationship, and a sense of ownership for their family because they know anybody can walk out the door really with not much consequences if there is no marriage. And so a lot of civic engagement and social trust decline as a product of declining marriage rates. Since marriage rates decline, that increases social distrust and it becomes a potentially downward spiral. We've seen this also with birth rates, with the percentage of out-of-wedlock children going up consistently between 1960 and 2008, where it's kind of stabilized somewhat since. It's also seen a divergence really across different parts of the world, where places where you have less social mobility and advancement beyond the lower middle class and the precarious class, you see much lower rates of marriage and higher rates of cohabitation outside of marriage. And places where there is still economic dynamism and social mobility, you have higher rates of marriage and lower rates of cohabitation. This is among developed economies. Where I disagree with Charles Murray on this, though, is that he thinks marriage is mostly a behavioral issue rather than an economic issue, whereas I think there are elements of both. His main issue is the hypocrisy, where a lot of the elite classes preach like this free flowing, free spirit, like don't get married, don't commit type of lifestyle, but yet they are disproportionately more likely to commit in traditional marriages and have traditional family structures. But what does this mean for class and marriage beyond just the fact that it exists? The main reason why it exists is the cost of weddings. In the 1950s, in the United States, and as recently as the 2000s in other developed markets such as Europe and in Singapore, weddings were done relatively cheaply. You'd have a wedding at a church or other place of worship, and you have a reception either in a family's backyard or a shaded pavilion as part of an apartment building. Like in Singapore, they called these void deck weddings, where instead of having apartments on the first few floors, they had this shaded kind of open air area on the ground below the apartments where people used to do weddings and community events. And it was not really socially unacceptable to do those kind of things, particularly for middle and working class couples. Just again, you didn't have fancy open bars. People maybe just brought a few bottles of wine. You didn't really have wedding planners or videographers. You maybe had a friend or photographer come to take a few quick photos versus it being a whole production today. And because of things such as popular culture and social media making it feel like a lot of these newer additions to wedding culture are a necessity, a lot of people are putting off marriage, having extra long engagements, or not getting married at all because they want to fit a certain model. This also goes to the increased expenses of certain outfits for weddings, certain procedures, higher quality food, a lot more staff to help coordinate and operate because it's more of a production than just like a social gathering, and increased cost of decor as well. So that all drives weddings and makes it more cost prohibitive for the work classes. The other component of this is weddings have become so performative. It's now kind of a social class measure in itself. Somebody who has a large wedding where they rent out an entire resort or a very upscale restaurant or professional wedding venue and have 200 plus guests, that is a class signal either of the couple themselves getting married or the parents of the couple who help finance it. It's a direct referendum of like your social status is how much of a big wedding you can either have for yourself or your children, because people judge you based on the extravagance of the wedding, because it's in our culture something that's like no expense held back type of thing. A lot of people don't want to come off as poor or underachieving compared to their higher social class friends. So they hold off a wedding or don't have it at all because they don't feel comfortable competing in the class game of the pomp and circumstance of higher end weddings. Even more modest weddings can be quite expensive, like a wedding with 100 people, keeping a lot of the other extraneous things to the minimum can still exceed 20 to 25,000 USD, which is half of after-tax pay in many cities in the United States. It's increasingly difficult to save for weddings, so I think drives this, and also economic uncertainty in general, because a lot of men, particularly when they get married, feel like they're taking the financial responsibility for their wives. And if they don't feel confident that they can do that in good times and bad, they are more scared to get married. And then the economic damage of divorce, and a lot of children of divorce see what happened to their families and how much financial damage that their parents had, especially usually fathers in previous generation, experienced because of it. But both sides of the divorce see a material decline in standard of living unless they're from a very wealthy background. The result of that makes people scared to get married because they might barely be able to afford a wedding, but they definitely can't afford, whether financially or emotionally or spiritually, the psychological and economic damage of a divorce. Let's break down how different classes treat marriage depending on where they stand in the American class hierarchy. The bottom is the dependent class, those basically reliant on public assistance or charities. In this lowest economic tier, marriage is viewed more as a luxury and out of their financial aspiration. Make enough money that you can even get close to affording a marriage, you lose your social benefits. So it's kind of disincentivized to advance in a certain degree. Also, they tend to have a very high bar of requirements for financial stability, often higher than other socioeconomic classes do for marriage. They don't feel confident that they can build a better financial future. They feel like they need it all turnkey, ready to go. Because of this, and certain personality traits or socioeconomic circumstances that bring people down to these levels, they tend to have children outside of marriage more than any other group, and they don't view it as a necessity for family life, more as a luxury bonus if they ever get there. And many of these groups will rely on cohabitation for financial reasons. The next level is the working and precarious class. In theory, these people value marriage, but increasingly less so. This is an example of prole drift, which I'm going to do a whole video on. Prole drift is the idea that the supposed negative habits of the lower classes trickling up to the rest of society. Some would argue that it's just because people become more open-minded and realize, wait, maybe there's reasons why the lower classes do these things and it can be useful for others too. Or the more cynical view, which I think might be more correct on this, is that a lot of people have moved down a class and they don't realize it, or they're going to end up in the class they weren't born in. And so they try to justify adopting adaptation strategies and coping strategies that lower classes previously have by making it perceivably more socially acceptable for somebody who had their upbringing. I'll go into other examples of prole drift in a future video, but marriage, or more accurately, the increase in cohabitation and the decline of marriage rates is a classic example of prole drift. And the precarious classes and the working class used to have consistently high marriage rates and have had the fastest declines. And there's a few reasons why for this. One is job insecurity makes people not feel comfortable to make a lifelong commitment to somebody because they just don't feel like they can prevent financial strain from destroying their marriages. I think it's deep down kind of subconscious to a certain degree. A lot of marriages and relationships have a hard time holding due to financial strain and financial reasons. And this group is more likely to cohabitate and kind of permanently settle down somebody who might not be a good fit because they benefit from the cost savings of sharing a place to live and pooling resources versus living by themselves. And so this group basically substitutes marriage for cohabitation. And they think that you need to be settled before getting married. And so they also, the working classes, it does have higher divorce rates than other classes outside the billionaire new money class. People feel like marriage is more of a gamble than people who have more stability, both familial and financial stability, in higher classes do. So really, I think marriage has died out among this class. And the precarious class is kind of the same as the people with working class incomes, but maybe have a traditionally high education like a bachelor's or a master's degree. See my video on genteel poverty for more details on this. The other key thing about family formation is that family formation is going down across the class ladder, but it's declining the fastest among the working and precarious classes because nobody wants to move down a class to have children. If you are barely making it without kids, or you're barely hitting your class level without children, if you have a child, it's likely to send you down a class due to increased costs of having a child and often having to sacrifice certain career ambitions or just having less work hours in general. The next level is the middle class, which are basically people who have a stable income from a single employer. This is probably the corner of the class structure that has the most stable and love-based marriages. Middle class people generally tend to socialize with other middle class people. They go to school or work with them, and that's how they meet. They're more likely to be compatible because of similar upbringing and values that have become a byproduct of being in the same class. And this class also is the highest rate of stable marriages. It has the lowest divorce rates because they have just a more stable sense of employment. They have a certain level of education that even if they lose their job, they're more likely to find another one. They have enough money to save consistently to buy a house or cover retirement to a certain degree. And as a result, they feel more confident to have children as well. This is the portion of the class hierarchy curve where marriage rates have dropped the least. However, you're starting to see even pearl drift climb to this level because a lot of people are afraid that if they do get married, have children, the stability of the middle class may not be as stable as previously, or a lot of people who think their middle class is more accurate really aren't. They are precarious or working class, but they still like to brand as middle class. And I think that's what's really going on with the declining marriage among the quote unquote middle class, because I don't think it really is among the real middle class. The middle class is not the 50% of the population in the middle of the income distribution. It's probably closer to the 5th to the 25th percentile of people, or maybe the 10th to the 30th. And we look at it that way, the true middle class is not really seeing decline in marriages. It's just people who think they're middle class really aren't. The next one is the independent professional class. These are self-employed people with a diverse set of clients, or just entrepreneurs in general with less than 7 figures of income and still have to actively work on their business. Their marriage approach is a little bit different. They view marriage as more of a partnership than both people having kind of the same role, like in a middle class relationship, or more traditional gender roles. What they kind of need is somebody who can kind of support their business growth and their ambition, but also be the supporting character in the sense of like they are willing to be like a teammate to help build like the life that the entrepreneurial partner is doing. I see a lot of these kind of couples where you have the guy doing the startup. It's usually this, but it can be the reverse with a female entrepreneur. The guy who's starting a business and he may not have as much of a stable income as maybe even somebody in the middle class, but he has some momentum and a lot of upside potential, whereas his spouse will have a more stable 9 to 5 type job that has insurance and other benefits, but may not pay very well. Her stability basically allows the other partner to be able to take more risk than if they had to support an entire family solely on the startup's founder's inconsistent income. And then once he does get successful, the wife can either keep doing the job if she'd like, or step back to raise a family, or do her own venture because the other guy is stable. These people also tend to get married at older ages than the previous class, the middle class, because their career trajectory isn't as predictable. It sometimes takes them a little longer to get to a certain escape velocity that their company or their practice is going to be stable and make it. They don't want to get married when they have inconsistency with their income. And often they want to wait to get married until after they pursue a startup. Previous generations who did get married and then try to pursue the business got a lot of scorn from their spouse, or their marriage would blow up because that person married them partially with the expectation that they would have a stable amount of income or be a sole provider, and they're not really consistently able to do that. And a lot of people just aren't wired to take that kind of risk or to be willing to help somebody out when they're not taking that kind of risk. Back when the general population got married younger, these couples had higher risk of divorce if one member is the independent professional class. In more modern days, I think that has come down to a certain degree because these people try to pursue their startups before they get married and try to not get married until they are a little bit more established. The other side of the coin is the institutional professional class, like high-ranking corporate and government roles, people who are 1 degree of separation from the establishment elite, a lot of executives, managers, and officials. A lot of them will get married maybe for more political reasons than purely romantic, because certain career paths and ambitions require you to be married. These are the people who care most about the idea of a power couple. They feel like they both need to be on the same level or trajectory to break out of this class and move into the next tier, which is the Ivy League class, and they might not be able to do it on their own or don't have the confidence to do it on their own. These people prioritize more. Are you also somebody in institutional professional class? Whereas other groups don't really care. The middle class, their incomes are pretty stable. The dual income lifestyle, especially once kids happen, doesn't really move them up a class. And if it does, it will just come back down to where it was before. The middle class isn't really as much of a chaser when it comes to this. In the entrepreneur class, a lot of people there are kind of betting on that they're going to make it big, and that's how they're going to move. So they don't care as much about the partner having just as high of a job or a prestigious level of social status or career. They don't really need to use their spouse for networking like the institutional professional class often does. So this is the group that prioritizes power couples, and they tend to be the most fussy about things like where their partner went to school or what type of jobs they have, etc. And this applies to both men and women. This is probably the one class where men tend to care more about careers than other groups do. Next is the Ivy League class. The Ivy League class are just kind of the level right below the old money elite. They are a little bit more romantic, actually, probably, than the institutional professional class. They do marry later, often in their 30s. They tend to pursue, mainly because they're pursuing advanced degrees, and it takes time to get those, or working very long hour type professions in their 20s, so they don't have time for dating. They also greatly value level of education, and they care about socioeconomic background, but they don't care as much about like, can my spouse's career help me with my networking? It's not like, it's more of like a power union versus a power couple. So yeah, they're more just trying to create a good context for keeping their children at their class and above versus trying to strive to move up. Because the gap between the Ivy League class and the establishment elite is too big to cover through a marriage with the peer of your own class. And these people realistically understand that. Whereas the institutional professional class could theoretically move up to the Ivy League class if they play all the right cards. This group tends to also have relatively stable marriages and lower divorce rates, but they are more likely to be aware of the financial risks involved with marriage and of higher uses of prenuptial agreements. The next level on the opposite side of the pyramid is the Cecil business owner class. There's really two types of marriages that go on with this. First, a lot of these people get married when they're still in the independent professional class, since their spouse who married them back when they were still proving themselves helped them along the way and stuck around. They usually will just stay with them and reward them for believing in them when they're down. Most people in the successful business owner class have a spouse in this category. I don't think they are as transactional as the higher new money counter elites often tend to be. They use the marriage similar as an investment in their personal happiness. So if they didn't get married until they got this level, then it's a little bit different. They might have a little bit more skepticism and mistrust of romantic partners because they weren't able to find somebody while they were still building, and they not sure if they wanted them just for who they are as a person or for what they've earned as a business owner. And so if they don't get married before they get successful, this is probably one of the more skeptical groups towards marriage, to be quite honest. The goal of the successful business owner is to create a family that can continue the family business. or for some of them who sell their companies, just more to have somebody to enjoy life with, but have relatively low expectations if they marry them later because of the lack of trust for not having somebody go through the struggles with them. The divorce rates could start to get higher because at this level, these people have their own money. They're probably protecting it in some sort, and they're probably more willing to have a control-based relationship. I think it's really two dynamics. It's either a long-term alliance built from when they were below the successful business owner class, or a more trophy relationship if they failed to meet somebody before they made it to the top. That's not always the case, but that's generally how these things play out. And then the new money, the top of the counter elite pyramid, these are probably the ones with the highest divorce rates. Billionaires in this group have over 50% divorce rate. This is like the groups such as like professional athletes, tech entrepreneurs like the Jeff Bezoses of the world, the Elon Musk, entertainers, etc., who were not really descendant of old money families, but kind of went 0 to 100 relatively quick. They generally have a higher divorce tolerance because if you get to this level, you have generally a higher risk tolerance, and they don't really have like family reputation or concerns of what people think. And so they're more okay with getting divorced. They don't see divorce as a moral failure like the middle classes do. They are at a certain level that everybody kind of wants to be around them no matter what. So they feel like they can make romantic partners a lot more disposable than other groups. And so in the old times, a lot of these people tried to marry into old money to gain legitimacy, particularly in the 19th century. Robber barons often wanted to marry their daughters into old money families to gain noble titles. But nowadays, people don't care as much about that. These people are more likely to either avoid getting married and just have several romantic partners they rotate through, or marry a more trophy asset because they already have all the wealth they ever would want, and they already kind of have all the social status, and people will suck up to them no matter what. There's really not much they gain from getting married unless they're a very religious or family oriented person. So they kind of just want, like, look at me. I've got the best looking person in the room, or I have the high status trophy asset that everybody else wants to be with. Since they are new money, they feel insecure relative to old money. So they see their spouse as a mean of showing off that, like, hey, I'm at your level or I'm better than you. And because of these lower based motivations, relationships on this level tend not to be as stable. And then last but not least, the establishment elite or the old money. For them, marriage is kind of a duty and a way to preserve wealth. So a lot of these families tend to marry people from other old money establishment families so that the wealth doesn't diminish by dilution and marrying into a family that might need financial support or may not have the assets to match. And so as a result, the next generation just gets poorer due to estates getting split. These people marrying into your own class at these levels also it's harder to relate to people who did not grow up with wealth. And so they just have a hard time relating to people. Like the new money, they often grew up in the middle class. So they can relate to lower socioeconomic status people because at some point in their life they were there. And same with anybody else on this pyramid, but the establishment elites, they're kind of a large gap between them. And so they have a hard time on this basic social level, like even making friends with people outside their class. Also, they have since they are into an old status family, people have been trying to curry their favor and try to take advantage of them since they were children. They don't have the same level of social trust as the middle class, where both parties have equal amounts to lose and not much to gain from one another. If you marry outside of your class in the establishment elite, they have something to gain and you have everything to lose. It also helps with your children's future marrying in your class because It expands your social network within your group and makes it easier to have access to elite institutions. And it helps boost your reputation if you combine the reputation of two of the great families instead of just having one of the great families. Divorce is generally rarer in this group. And if it happens, it's a lot more discreet and kept out of the public eye. They still tend to socialize, even if they do remarry, still within their groups and don't really branch out beyond it. So overall, that's kind of a class by class view on marriage. In general, marriage rates on the whole have been declining, but a lot of that is pearl drift disguised in more individualistic values. In Europe, for example, you have much higher rates of cohabitation and children without marriage than in the United States, but not because they are somewhat more progressive. It's really more just that the natural way their economic structure works with relatively high taxes, relatively generous social safety nets, and not much of a wealth gap between people. Let me know what your thoughts are on this. Do you think I'm right about how different social classes get married and don't? I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you for watching.